Continuing our look at Henry David Thoreau's On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, we'll take a look at voting. Now, when it comes to goodness in doing things, such as civil activism, etc., Thoreau has the following view, that he claims people tend to think that it's not important that the many, most people be good. What is important is that there is at least some absolute goodness to leaven the whole. Basically, kind of like a bread metaphor. The idea being that I guess you kind of have like some absolute goodness, and it makes up for not having everyone or most people be good. Now, Thoreau thinks this is not a good thing, and he notes correctly that thousands of people oppose slavery and war, the Mexican War that he's focused on, in their opinions, but actually ended up doing nothing. They hesitated, regretted, sometimes they would petition, but nothing is done with earnest or with effort. They wait, well disposed, for others to do something about it. Now, so this does raise a question that's still relevant today, that oftentimes when people are expressing their views, they will do exactly that. Like, obviously when Thoreau was around, they didn't have social media, but people will often, put forth like a virtuous tweet or a Facebook post, or maybe even make a YouTube video expressing their views. They might sign a petition, or they might go and protest. And so a good question is, do these kind of things, do they have any meaningful effect? And I mean, one might say, at least in the case of protest, that a person, they're presenting kind of a threat to the existing order, so maybe that would have some effect. Now, he also notes that at most people simply give up what he calls a cheap vote. And not surprisingly, given what he says, he's very critical of voting. Now, this may seem, rather surprising because we're typically told, at least by some, how important voting is and how it's critical to a democracy and how powerful it is in changing things, at least by some people. Now, of course, there's also a strong political movement in the United States that tries to push people into apathy, that they shouldn't vote, their vote doesn't really matter, they shouldn't really care, and that has proven very successful because voting turnout in the United States is generally really bad, actually. The press gets all excited when there's like a what they consider a decent turnout, but still a relatively low percentage. And so as a practical matter, you end up with people who get elected, they get maybe a majority of the voters sometimes, but that of course is a small percentage of the population. And some philosophers have argued that in most cases people are not actually elected with a majority, that they end up with a majority of the minority numerically who vote. So why is Thoreau so critical of voting, despite the fact, again, we're often told how important it is by at least some people? Well, he sees voting as a form of gambling, with a moral tinge, and he notes, of course, correctly that there's a lot of betting on voting. So what does he mean by gaming? Well, he doesn't go into detail, but you could look at it kind of in the sense of like buying a lottery ticket. When you buy a lottery ticket, you hope you win, but of course your chances of winning are extremely low, typically. And so when a person votes, they're casting hopefully just a single vote, unless it's like a multi-vote election, and they're basically hoping that they'll win this, by in a way by chance. There'll be more people, voting the way they vote, and they'll win. So he thinks there's really not the person is not staking their character, and a person cast their vote as they think is right. But he claims, and this may be kind of unfair, that people vote without a vital concern that the right should prevail. Again, the correct, not the political right. And he thinks, again, it's gambling because it's left up to the majority. When someone throws their vote in, it's one vote out of many, perhaps thousands or millions, and they're kind of hoping that enough other people who vote do so that they end up in the majority. So he's very critical of voting because he thinks that voting for the moral, right, not the political right, does nothing for goodness. At best, it's a feeble expression of the desire should prevail. Basically, throwing one slip of paper into a vast sea of paper, hoping, or clicking a lever or something, hoping that the majority will come about. So he thinks this is a mistake because, on his view, the wise don't leave leave goodness to chance. And he also claims, perhaps incorrectly, that it's unwise to want goodness prevail through the power of the majority. Because, again, he has kind of a down view of the masses, and he says there's little virtue in their actions. So, if, contrary to what we're often told, voting is not a good thing, what then should be done? Now, his criticism of voting essentially is that it doesn't accomplish things, that it's just this tiny, if a person votes, they're essentially just adding one, tiny +1 to the vote total and just hoping that they happen to be in the majority. And it's a, tiny contribution, which, to be fair, is a reasonable criticism. When you do vote, your vote might count, depending on the laws where you're voting and how the ballots get handled, etc., and how things work out. But even at best, that it does count, it's simply at most a +1 to that total, a tiny contribution. Now, in counter, you could say that each vote that is counted does count. It's an interesting question whether voting is effective or not. So, what does Thoreau think we should do, given he opposes or thinks voting is basically gambling? As I see it, we have an obligation not just to cast a ballot and just kind of hope that we might win. He begins with a pretty heavy-duty duty, namely that he claims it is a person's duty to devote themselves to the eradication of any wrong, which is a pretty extreme obligation, that you're obligated to eradicate any wrong that exists. Kind of a superhero level of ethics. Now, he then quickly kind of ratchets this down. He says, well, a person could still properly, of course, have other concerns. Then he says, well, at the very least, his duty is to wash their hands of it and not support it. And then what he means by this is that even if a person is engaged in other pursuits and activities, that they must not pursue them sitting on another's shoulders, essentially most likely being critical of slavery and exploitation here. And so, again, he kind of begins with a very extreme view, you must eradicate all wrong, and then it kind of slides down to, well, at the very least, don't support wrongdoing. That's kind of the least of things. And this does raise a more general moral question about our moral obligations. Do we have an obligation to fight all wrongs, or do we have an obligation just to not, actively support them? And of course, there's a wide range in between. Now, he also thinks that, interestingly, that the mistakes, the evil of governments, are often supported by virtuous people. That, for example, a soldier might be applauded for refusing to serve in an unjust war, but applauded by those who actually sustain the government that is making that war. And he thinks that, in an interesting point, that the errors, the misdeeds, mistakes, and evils of government require actual, virtue to sustain it. How so? Well, he puts forward something that does seem plausible, that people who, although they disapprove of the government, give it allegiance and support, become its most conscientious supporters, and are often the most serious obstacles to reform. He doesn't go into great detail as to why, but one reason that could be put forth is they provide like a moral cover, that the government can point to them and say, look, these good, conscientious people, support us, so we can't be all bad, right? And of course, having good people supporting and serving a government they disapprove of does give it that support. Now, when it comes to action, Thoreau makes kind of an interesting, contrast that in some cases people, simply cannot be satisfied to merely have an opinion. And he gives the example: imagine you're cheated of a single dollar by one's neighbor. And of course, back when he was writing, a dollar had quite a bit more purchasing power compared to today because of inflation and all the stuff and how money works. And he says, if someone who's cheated by their neighbor, they would not be satisfied with simply knowing they're cheated, or saying to other people that been cheated, or with simply petitioning the neighbor to pay. That a person would typically take steps to get the money and avoid being cheated by that neighbor. Now, and this, of course, for him, he thinks should be something that applies not just to like getting money from a neighbor who has cheated one, but should be applied to things involving the state. So he's kind of noting that when it comes to, say, being cheated for even a small amount of money, people realize that simply just talking about it or petitioning or protesting not going to do anything. They need to take action. So what do they need to take action against? Well, Thoreau claims that unjust laws do exist. Now, this is both a empirical question and, of course, a value question, because empirically you have to look at the laws, but whether a law is unjust or not would be a matter of value. And not surprisingly, people can have different perceptions and even make good faith arguments as to which laws are just and unjust. And so, for example, a law that, say, greatly benefits the rich, but at the expense of harming the less well-off, someone who's rich may honestly believe this is a just and fair law, whereas the people that are hurt by it would probably think otherwise. And this is not to say that morality is thus relative. It's just that whether a law is unjust or not, could be an objective matter, but not surprisingly, people's perspective of the law, perception of it, would affect whether they think it is just or unjust. Now, Thoreau claims that people generally think, at least in the United States that he's writing about, they tend to think that it's better to simply wait until a majority is persuaded to change these laws. Because the argument is that, resisting the remedy of resisting would be worse than the evil. And this brings about kind of a conservative viewpoint where you just kind of wait for slow change, hoping for it to tick over to 51%, and then the idea being that it would be remedied. Now, Thoreau is critical of this because he believes that the government is to blame for this, because if the remedy is worse than the cure worse than the disease, he thinks it's because those in government make it so, that they are kind of probably intentionally making the cost high, so people knowing that people will simply go along with it. Thoreau, though, thinks that people should resist injustice. So he looks at the matter of punishment and how it works. And he claims, in the time he's writing, that one would think that a deliberate and practical denial of its authority is the only offense not actually considered by the government, because it doesn't assign a definite, suitable, and proportionate penalty that, at least according to how Thoreau sees it. So he is, what he presents, of course, is taxes. And he says if a person who doesn't have property, someone who's poor, refuses once to earn 9 shillings, basically, the United States never used, I don't believe ever used shillings as currency, but basically a tiny amount of money for the state, then they would be imprisoned. Now, today, of course, you could look at this empirically. Do people who are poor, if they violate, some law or rule for paying money to the state, do they end up, being imprisoned and penalized more? And of course, you'd want to go and do, a Google search of credible sources to confirm all this. But yeah, Thoreau's claim is definitely right about today. That if a person, say, has a faulty light in their car, they're pulled over, they're fined, and if they're poor, of course, they have to pay more fines and more fines, and they could end up leading to prison, because one of the most dangerous things to be in the United States today is to be poor. So definitely right about that. Now he says, in contrast, if someone steals 90 times 9 shillings, basically a lot of money from the state, they're soon set free. And this also seems to often be true, because when people, are engaged in, politicians and so forth, and people who are well off and powerful commit various financial crimes, they don't seem to face much in the way of consequences. So Thoreau does seem right. I mean, again, this is something that you can look up from credible sources and see that's pretty much how the system works, just in terms of who gets punished the most and who rarely gets punished. So what does he advocate in terms of doing? Well, not surprisingly, since the title of the essay is On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, it's going to be, obviously no spoilers, civil disobedience. So he considers maybe if injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, he, in his metaphor, says maybe it will wear itself smooth or wear itself out. But if the injustice has its own exclusive part, the remedy, might be worse than the evil. So what he thinks to do is this. Again, this is the civil disobedience part. If the system, the government, requires you to be an agent of injustice to another person, he advocates breaking the law. Simply don't do that. Be a counter-friction to stop the machine. Now, consistent with what he said earlier, even though Thoreau advocates, being a counter-friction to stop the machine, basically breaking the laws, he also, notes that a person should not lend themselves to, the wrong that they condemn. And he's thinking, primarily here about the Fugitive Slave Act, and that one should simply not support it. But this would apply broadly to any law that one regards as unjust. Now, again, this, of course, raises the question we've, considered multiple times. One would have to consider, is the state actually bad, and is one actually just? But this is kind of not necessarily a special moral dispute, because one always has to raise the question, am I the baddie, so to speak? Not like bat, but bad. And he thinks that if someone is more right than their neighbors, they constitute an interesting phrase, a majority of one already. So in terms of resisting this injustice, what he advocates is this. Now, as I noted, he went to prison for one night. So he's not like a hardcore person who's did hard time in a major prison, but he did get locked up. So he has that. And he claims, and this is something that gets echoed later by Dr. King, is that if a government is imprisoning people unjustly, the true place for a just person is also in prison. Now, as a practical matter, there is the concern if someone gets locked up that they'll lose their influence. But he says this would not be the case, that their influence would not lost there, and they would be like an enemy within its walls. Now, that is, of course, a very practical question. If one does get locked up, are you neutralized? And the answer is, of course, well, it depends. So if it's a state that's extremely oppressive and people basically get banished into prisons, then no, prison would be, a bad place to be, because one is done. Now, there are cases, of course, where people, even though they're in prison, they do have a great deal of influence. Dr. King, Nelson Mandela, etc. But as a practical matter, this usually requires that a person is already kind of well known, or has some sort of celebrity or international status, in order to be able to maintain kind of communication from the jail, or at least retain the world's attention. So, like with pretty much everything else in life, I guess it depends on how interesting and important you are to people outside. Now he claims that truth is much stronger than error, and he does raise an interesting point about people who have experienced injustice. And he claims, based on his one night in jail, that one who has experienced injustice can much more eloquently and effectively combat it. Now, his view of revolution is not through violence. Now, there are anarchists, and were anarchists, who advocated violence, such as Emma Goldman, who advocated, seemed to be accepting the use of violence, provided it was directed against, the right people. But Thoreau is definitely in the non-violent anarchist group, and hence, civil disobedience, as opposed to advocating on the duty to armed revolution. And so he thinks that you should vote, metaphorically speaking, not by just, putting marks on a strip of paper, but by using your whole influence. And he claims that a numerical minority would be powerless as long as it simply conforms to the numerical majority. But he thinks the numerical minority can have a great deal of force, because if the numerical minority acts collectively as a group, it can clog the machine. And so what he's advocating essentially is something that was, again, later used effectively by Gandhi and Dr. King, essentially is to basically have people civilly disobey, get arrested, and start clogging up the prison system. And he claims that if the state has a choice between, locking up all good people or giving up, and he's writing the context of the war against Mexico and slavery, he claims the state will give up on them. Now, obviously enough, when Thoreau was writing, there wasn't a mass resistance to slavery peacefully. There wasn't a mass resistance to the war, so none of that happened. So I don't know if that would have worked if he could have gotten a mass movement going. Now later we see with Gandhi that it seems to have been effective, and then with Dr. King, it also seemed to have an effect as well. Maybe in part because, in the case of Dr. King, there was mass media, and so the protest and arrest and treatment of people protesting, dogs being turned on them, water hose and beatings and so forth, got national attention. And of course, the United States was also involved in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and the Soviets were very critical, even though, of course, they were also doing terrible things. They were very, using that as a great deal of effective propaganda that the United States, the democracy, was doing this awful stuff. He also advocates, and this is something that would appeal to libertarians, not paying taxes as a means of peaceful, resistance. And he claims that not paying taxes as a protest would be obviously not as violent or bloody as paying them, enabling the state to commit violence and shed innocent blood, basically engage in war. So he thinks that's a peaceful revolution. Disobey unjust laws, get arrested, clog up the prisons, refuse to pay taxes when the government is acting unjustly. I guess that would also involve getting locked up. He also thinks that people holding political office should resign in protest. And he thinks that if this occurs, if the people refuse allegiance, refuse to pay taxes, and the political, the officers, the people enabling that work for the higher-ups, then he thinks the revolution would be accomplished. Basically, mass civil disobedience. Now, obviously, in his own time, didn't work. And this, of course, brings up the issue today about how you bring about, social change. And there's the classic debate of, violence versus nonviolence, and how that would work. So he's providing kind of a vague map for civil disobedience. Basically, disobey unjust laws, don't pay your taxes, everyone resign, and then hope that it works out. Now, property. Now, Thoreau is focused on imprisonment rather than the state simply taking his stuff. And he notes, maybe correctly, that the people who are most dangerous to a state that is corrupt will typically have very little property, because as a matter of fact, people who, are good and oppose, corruption of the state, they generally wouldn't be obviously aided much by the state, and they would generally not be particularly well off or wealthy. And to such people, Small taxes would appear fairly exorbitant because the state is not doing much for them, and they have very, very little in the way of possessions. Now, of course, one can counter and put forth the idea of the heroic billionaire who opposes the evil of the state that has enabled them to become billionaires and protects them with the legal system, etc. But I guess one could make kind of a case for the heroic libertarian billionaire. But in general, the people that are most likely to protest a state that is corrupt would tend to be not particularly wealthy, because if one is wealthy and successful, then the state is probably helping you and not really harming you, unless you're just like some incredibly capable and able to operate without any government assistance and without assistance of laws, etc. Next is the question of money and virtue. Now, as we've seen multiple times when we talked about various virtue theorists, they're very concerned with money, wealth, and virtue. Now, virtue theorists like Wollstonecraft and Aristotle and Confucius generally take the view that people can obviously be corrupted by wealth and money and so forth, but their kind of main approach is that it's not necessarily that being wealthy or well off is automatically corrupting. It involves like how one gets that wealth. So Wollstonecraft was very critical of the corrupting effects of just simply inheriting wealth and not earning it, and Confucius was very critical of acquiring wealth in unjust ways. Now, Thoreau is kind of broadly critical of richness, being rich in general. First, he notes, seemingly correctly, again, one would want to assess this critically, that rich people are generally sold to the institutions that make them rich. That is to say, they tend to support the laws, the policies, etc., that make them wealthy. So you typically don't see, again, millionaires and billionaires advocating for more taxes, seriously and making that happen, or voluntarily paying more taxes, typically. And you generally don't see them, opposing institutions that support and protecting them. And he claims, kind of a money is the root of evil thing, that the more money, the less virtue. And he gives an argument that is similar to the one Wollstonecraft presents, which is that money comes between a person and the objects they wish to obtain, and obtains them for them. And it's no great virtue to obtain things when one has a lot of money, or so he claims. And so he thinks that kind of the way it makes things easier, that it takes away a moral ground. And he claims, perhaps incorrectly, that opportunities of living are diminished in proportion as the means are increased. And this is something that can be debated. So his view is a negative one of wealth. The main points being that, for the most part, rich people would be sold in supporting an institution that makes them rich. I mean, there could be exceptions, but it does make sense if the system, taxes and laws and so forth makes me rich, I'd be more inclined, of course, to support it. He also, again, takes the view that more money, less virtue. So this property also has an influence on obedience, because in the case of people who need the protection of the government and fear that disobedience will result in their property being taken away, they'll tend to obey the state, because they need its protection from, other citizens, justly or unjustly. And Thoreau says, I guess because was really poor, he doesn't rely on the state. So he does note that if he denies the authority of the state to tax him, and he's concerned about that, it will take his stuff. And so he claims that it's impossible to live both honestly, that is to say, not support an unjust state, and comfortably, because the state will take stuff away. And he thinks it won't be worth it to accumulate property if one is, critical of the state, because it will be taken away. Now, in terms of whether this is accurate or not, I guess the answer, of course, is always it depends. In the United States currently, there are people who literally don't pay their taxes what they're supposed to pay. And it's not typically, obviously, the people who are very poor because they wouldn't have a lot of money to pay. Not surprisingly, it tends to be people who are very wealthy, for the obvious reason they have lots of money. And interestingly, and this is something you would wish to, you'd want to confirm through credible sources, that the IRS generally goes not after people who are, very wealthy. They tend to go after people who are the poorest. And, this can have really bad consequences. And so Thoreau is right in a way that the state will take property from some, but also in a way incorrect, because if someone is very well off and not paying their taxes, they generally can get away with it for a really long time, unless they do something really kind of obvious, or do things publicly to attract the attention and make it such that the IRS might have to consider maybe doing something. Now, he does reference Confucius. I noted earlier that he's kind of operating a bit in the virtue theory field. And he likes what Confucius says, which is, if the state is a good state, governed by principles of reason, then being poor and miserable would be shameful. And if a state is, a bad state, then being wealthy and honored in that state would be shameful. Because his reasoning is, of course, that in a good state, then, not being able to do well in a state that is rational and good, a person would have to really be doing a bad job. But of course, if a state is evil and one is doing really well, then one is benefiting from that evil, then that would be shameful. So what he thinks he should do, and of course he advocates this for others, is that in his own case, of course, he doesn't really want the protection of the state, and he can afford to refuse allegiance to it. He can simply, in kind of, a twist on Socrates' view. Socrates says the state benefited me, so I should obey. Thoreau is essentially saying, if the state's not benefiting me, then I have no reason to obey. And he can refuse to give the state a right to his property and life, because he thinks this would be, it cost him less to incur the penalty of disobedience than it would be to, become a bad person and obey. And he would feel worth less if he obeyed the state. As I mentioned in the background, Thoreau served one night in jail, and not a particularly, a pretty nice jail. And he thinks, based on his one night of experience, that the jail is a foolish institution, because the state is acting like, locking up his body somehow, stops him. And he claims, that they're punishing his body, but not engaging, what's really dangerous about him, which is his ideas. And he does do what does seem to be a correct analysis of how the state engages people. He notes, seemingly correctly, that the state never intentionally confronts a person intellectually or morally. That is to say, typically doesn't engage in, a moral debate about the ethics of things, but engage people's, physically. And this, to use kind of a silly example, in a way is kind of right, because we don't equip our police with, moral training in terms of like engaging in moral debates with citizens, carefully analyzing the ethics of situations, etc. In fact, the police get pretty minimal training, very little training compared to pretty much all other professions. And a lot of it focuses, not surprisingly, on, the use of force and violence. And so the state typically engages with us physically, hurting us, shooting, beating, tasering, locking people up, fining people, etc. And Thoreau says the reason for this is kind of obvious, because the state, the people running the state, are not superior in intellect or honesty, but they do, of course, command greater physical strength. That is to say, they have police forces and military, etc., and can hurt individuals and make them comply with force. And Thoreau says, in a bit of defiance, that he was not born to be forced and will breathe after his own fashion. Now, he seems, of course, really mad about the taxes, again, because he got locked up for one night for not paying a tax. And he gives a very anarchist, but also maybe a kind of libertarian view, which is this. he says when the government says your money or your life, why should you be in haste to give it money? And he notes the government may, be in great need, may not know what to do, but he makes kind of an interesting point that the state needs to help itself, that he is not responsible for the working of the machinery of society. So it's kind of an interesting point about our obligations to, pay taxes and support the state. And Rousseau takes here kind of definitely an anarchist view in the case of the oppressive state, that we shouldn't support them. This view would also be appealing to many modern libertarians and some people who, conservative talking points, that this, essentially the state is on its own, and also, of course, the view that other citizens are on their own. The classic question, why should I pay money, to benefit other people? And Thoreau almost seems to be taking this view here. Now, lest you think he's sort of I don't care about other people, I'm not going to help people out. He doesn't actually, as we'll see later, he doesn't actually take that view, because he's an anarchist. He's opposed to the state, but he's not opposed to, things like having roads and so forth. And we'll see more of that in a bit. So after his one night in prison, he claims it really opened his eyes, that he saw the state more distinctly. He saw the extent to which his neighbors could be trusted as good neighbors and friends. And he said they were basically, fair weather friends. They didn't really propose to do what is right. And he thinks that they were, revealed as being prejudiced and superstitious, and that they were unwilling to make risks, to sacrifice to humanity, not even to their property. So he saw himself as kind of this special exception, again, after his one night in prison. So what about taxes? Now, again, previously you might get the impression that Thoreau is saying we don't owe anybody else anything, the government is on its own, and that could be interpreted as the view that everyone else is on their own. You just have no obligations to other citizens or other people, and, everyone's, kind of state of nature. But Thoreau, he does note that he does pay the highway tax. Why? Well, because he wants to be a good neighbor and a bad subject. So he doesn't pay the state because he doesn't want to, contribute to the state, which he sees as wrong. Now, in the case of his money, he doesn't, want to have to trace the course of every dollar to it buys, somebody, someone a gun. What he's concerned about is the effects of his allegiance. So saying to Thoreau, you're throwing money into these taxes, and it doesn't really contribute much to the things that you oppose, so just go along. He's concerned not with the particular effects, but also with the effects of his allegiance, that having an allegiance to the state is morally bad. Now, he considers an objection, namely that perhaps it's the case that people do mean well and are simply ignorant. If they knew better, they would do better. So why, trouble your neighbors? Why not just leave them alone? Now, he says, there's no reason why he should do as they do, or permit others to suffer a greater pain or a different kind. So basically his view is, he should definitely, trouble his neighbors, even if they're not inclined to go along with his views, or his moral views.